Go, well, wait a minute, this is a different time. No, this is not a different time. This is the same message that started in chapter 10. The angel is not dating this prophecy for us. The angel is telling us from the first year of Darius, I was appointed to oversee Persia. The first year of Darius is when Persia becomes a nation. All right, so Persia overthrows the Babylonian Empire, and from the very beginning, God sends an angel to supervise, to protect, to shepherd Persia through its time. And it has a limited time. It has a time that God has set for it, a time to rise up, a time to have power, and a time to eventually be destroyed. And God does that for nations. God does that for every nation. In fact, we're going to see some things today that may cause you to look at the headlines a little bit differently, that we read about what's happening around the world and in nations today. So that date that we see at the beginning of chapter 11 is not a date for when Daniel gets the prophecy, but the angel is speaking, and he's just dating when his duty over Persia began. All right, if somebody would read verse 1 through 4 for us. Yes, chapter 11, verse 1 through 4.
And in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him. Now then I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will appear in Persia, and then a fourth, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will appear, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases. After he has appeared, his empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others.
All right. In the Persian Empire, there are at least 11 kings that we know of throughout the history of the Persian Empire. And I say that we know of, there may have been a few more. It's ancient history, and sometimes records are lost, and sometimes there's more than one claimant to the throne, as their method of succession was either you appoint your son or somebody big and strong enough overthrows the current ruler and takes over, which is kind of the way of the world. And so of those 11, you look at the beginning of this prophecy and you go, well, wait a minute, he's only talking about, looks like about 4 guys here. How do I get 11 out of 4? Well, there's several different ways to look at this. One is to say he's only focusing on certain key individuals, and there's only about 4 of these 11 kings that are involved in the battle with Greece. Remember, going all the way back to chapter 8, we had this warfare between Greece and Persia that's predicted with the ram and the goat, and that whole chapter is about. So there are 4 kings that are specifically involved in that, and maybe that's the 4 kings he's talking about. I think if you've got a workbook, I kind of, at least at the time I wrote the workbook, I saw that as a very viable explanation. There's probably a better explanation, though, is that he's taking us to a certain point. He's taking us to Artaxerxes, who really opens up this can of worms in warfare between Persia and Greece. Artaxerxes' father Xerxes was the one involved in the Battle of Marathon, which was actually a defeat for the Persians. But Artaxerxes is the one that leads this massive Persian army that actually conquers a large part of Greece. But in doing so, he bleeds his army so badly that the Greeks were able to rise up and throw them off about a year later. And the Persians never returned to Greece after that. It would eventually be the Greeks going in and invading Persia. And so Artaxerxes is really the guy that kicked the hornet's nest, or however you want to put it. And in that case, it fits perfectly because Artaxerxes is kind of the fourth guy in this list of Persian kings. And I won't bore you with all the Persian kings, but again, that's something that's easily available for you online, and you can, with very little effort, meld together ancient history and the biblical account and see how these things overlap. All right, if I could, let's get somebody to read verse 5 all the way down through verse 19.
Then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His domain will be a great dominion indeed. After some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power. But she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he will deal with them and display great strength. Also, their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels with silver and gold, he will take into captivity to Egypt. And he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. His sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his British fortress. The king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, but that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. When the multitude is carried away, his part will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval of some years he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege for him, and capture a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even their choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand.
When you read through this and you see the detail of it, and you see what God is saying is going to happen, I want you to kind of put yourself in the place of one of those kings of the north or the south. Imagine if you were good or bad, if you were brave or cowardly, would it make any difference? God's already said, here's what the outcome's going to be. And for every one of those kings that God has put in that place, their fate, so to speak, is already decided by God. And that is true for every nation on earth, and that is true for every national leader on earth. I'm not talking about their personal destiny, whether they go to heaven or hell. I'm not talking about whether they'll be a good person or a bad person, but God already has arranged, when he set the very first planet in motion, for everything to fall out in the universe in a certain way. God wins in the end. God lives outside of time, space, and matter. He sees all of it. He sees the beginning to the end. And so when God prophesies, when he says historically here, or prophetically, here's what's going to happen. History's going to match that exactly. And one of the best cases in point is this chapter of the book of Daniel. It's actually very amazing. Beginning in verse 5 through verse 9, we have a period involving an attempted truce, an attempted alliance between the king of the north and the king of the south. Back in verse 4, it talks about this sovereign of Persia is going to be uprooted and his land given to another. We don't get very much information about that, but ultimately that's going to happen when Alexander rolls in. Alexander's going to defeat the Persian Empire in a lightning campaign of 3 years. He's going to fight over a dozen major battles, 3 of them decisive. And in a very quick period, he's going to conquer all the Persian Empire, and then he's going to spend another couple of years extending the borders further to the east. And it was probably the most amazing military accomplishment of all human history. Nothing like it has happened since. Alexander is somebody worth studying if you're into military type things. But that's all the end of verse 4. Alexander, however, was kind of, he was a drunkard. He probably was a bisexual. He had a lot of problems. And so he died at the ripe old age of 33. Possibly he was poisoned. Possibly it was his own lifestyle choices. Possibly he succumbed to some of his wounds, or maybe a combination thereof. And he dies at 33, throwing this massive empire that he has created that has not had a chance to solidify, that's made up of many disparate peoples, throwing it into chaos. And his successors, basically his 4 top generals, sort of divided up the kingdom amongst themselves, because they knew nobody could hold this whole thing together like Alexander had done. And there was about 30 years of warfare between these 4, because right away you start thinking, hey, if I only had this little extra piece of land, my part of the kingdom would be more secure. And so they fight amongst themselves. Those original 4 entities kind of morph a little bit. They change. It's not the 4 that existed at the end of the successor wars were not the same as the 4 who started it, because new groups arose. A few of the original groups died out, but eventually you've still got 4 successor kingdoms that more or less solidify. We're not concerned with the western 2 of those, the one that got Greece and the one that got Thrace and some of Asia Minor and stuff. Those 2 guys are not involved in this prophecy, but the ones that are the 2 eastern kingdoms. The king of the north, in your mind and mine, think of Syria as kind of being the central headquarters for the king of the north. For the king of the south, think of Egypt. And what's lost to us, there's a big kerfuffle right now because Netflix has just released a thing about Cleopatra, and the Egyptians are all incensed because Cleopatra is not played by somebody that looks like an Egyptian. Well, guess what? Cleopatra didn't look like an Egyptian. Cleopatra looked like a Greek, because the royals that ruled Egypt were not Egyptians, they were Greeks, at least for quite a while. I'm sure there was a lot of intermingling, and ultimately they became Egyptians. Just as an aside, talk about that reminded me, I was walking around the old city of Damascus, Syria, and I was looking at the wall, and there's one place where outside the wall it dips way down, and so you can see all these different layers of the wall. You can see the ancient Aramean wall, and you can see the Persian stones. And there's different cuts of stone that you can actually determine. And after the Persian stones, you can see the Greek cut, which is kind of the finest, and they're all just exactly the same. And then the Roman, and then the Byzantine, and ultimately the top parts of the wall is just kind of mud, and that's the Islamic period. And you can literally look at the wall, and I was standing remarking to the Syrian I was with about this and pointing out the difference in those stones. And he said, well, that all sounds very good, but we just think of it as Syrian, 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 Syrian. Because from their viewpoint, all those folks that built those different parts of the wall were Syrian. And it sort of changed the way I look at things a little bit. But and that doesn't have much to do with our story, but what we're dealing with is successors to the Greek kingdom that are ruling over these disparate empires composed in both cases of many different folks. And guess who's in between Syria and Egypt? Why this matters. Israel is right there in the middle. When they go to fighting each other, Israel is the stomping grounds that those armies have to cross over. And it's mostly going to be controlled by the kings of the north, but it's going to pass back and forth. The kings of the north in this passage are what history calls the Seleucids, the Seleucid Empire. And we name them using pretty much two names, either Seleucus or Antiochus. So you got Seleucus the first, Antiochus the second, and so on. For the Ptolemies, that's the rulers of Egypt, PTO, Ptolemy. We name them Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third. Now, all these guys had other names, but it's real easy for the historian because you can just say Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third. So this is the warfare between the Seleucids in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt, with Israel right here in between. And they're going back and forth. So in those first few verses through verse 9, they're attempting to make a truce or an alliance between them. So the first king of the south is Ptolemy the first, and he's trying to make an alliance. In verse 6, you go to Ptolemy the second, and he's going to work with Antiochus the second. And you're also going to bring in Bernice, who is a daughter of Ptolemy the second, and she's going to actually poison somebody. See, all these people have real names, and we can look back in history and we say this person did this and this person did that. When we get to verse 7, we've got the brother of Bernice, who now is the king of the south, Ptolemy the third, and he's still going up against Seleucus the second. Verse 8, Ptolemy the third is going to be fairly successful. And by verse 9, you've got Seleucus the second breaking the truce and invading Egypt. And so we're reading King of the North and King of the South, but these are an ever-changing cast of characters that are filling those offices. And so once the truce is broken, for the rest of this passage, there's going to be open warfare between the two groups. And the sons of the king of the north are the sons of Seleucus II, and they're going to be Seleucus III and Antiochus III. So they're going to succeed each other as kings. And Seleucus III is going to take some of the Egyptian possessions in Asia Minor, or what we call Turkey. He's going to kind of work on conquering and kicking them out of Turkey. Egypt also retained control of the island of Cyprus through almost all of this. Cyprus was attacked one time in this. After Seleucus is killed and Antiochus III becomes the king in verse 10, he's going to actually attacked Egypt, which at that point was still controlling Israel. So the kings of the south in verse 10 are still in control of Israel. And so part of attacking Egypt is to drive their forces out of Israel and take over Israel. In verse 12, Ptolemy IV is successful in killing thousands of Antiochus III's troops. It's not a complete victory, but he inflicts a heavy loss which impacts the balance of power. And then in verse 13, Antiochus III, now that he's had to go back and raise a new army, and he's coming back to Egypt with this new army to fight. And that's those first 13 verses. Then in verse 14 through 20, we continue the story, and it gets a lot more personal for the Jews because now they're getting kind of caught up in this. Antiochus III, because he lost so many men fighting and had to raise a new army, he's raising them throughout his empire. And part of his empire that he now controls is Israel. And so he's essentially forcing conscription. He's making every region give up so many men to fill his army. And the Jews did not want to participate in that. They didn't want to march behind pagan idols, which, remember, these are Greeks. They celebrated all the Greek gods. Their religion was the Greek pantheism, and they are, once you're incorporated into their army, you're essentially fighting for Greek gods, no matter which of those two armies you're on. The Jews wanted to kind of sit on the sidelines and not be involved in that and be able to worship Jehovah. And so you start to see in verse 14, there are Jews that join the army of Antiochus III, and they might have done so looking at this prophecy in Daniel 11, and thought, well, the king of the north is going to prevail. I want to be on the winning side. But not necessarily getting exactly the right king of the north, or realizing that the king of the north is ultimately going to represent evil. Antiochus III in verse 15 captures the seaside city of Sidon. Tyre and Sidon have a long history in that area. They ultimately have a history that goes all the way into the very future. They're going to be involved in some of the final battles on earth. And because of their location, because of their wealth from their large trading fleets, Tyre and Sidon were important places. And so we see them appear in prophecy quite frequently. In verse 16, Antiochus III is going to now occupy Israel and begin fortifying it and begin the process of Greekifying Israel. Now, when you step into the New Testament, you read sometimes in the Gospels about Jesus traveling through the Decapolis. Anybody know what the Decapolis is? All right, 10 cities, which is interesting because if you go there today, there were actually 13 cities. But somewhere along the line, it got the name 10 cities. Decapolis is literally Greek for 10 cities, Decapolis, Decapolis. And so these were Seleucid cities. These were Greek. They had temples to the Greek gods, to Zeus especially, and Apollo, and all the different Greek gods. They had, at least among the elites of the city, there was a very Greek culture. They wore Greek dress. Everything was very Greek. And so afterwards, once the Romans move in and start reassigning governments, the Decapolis was not included under the procurator of Syria, but it was separated out by the Romans, even though it had the same culture as Syria. And so the Romans kind of set the Decapolis up as its own independent place, but it was Gentile. It was very few Jews lived in the Decapolis. And if they did, they were considered foreigners. It was an extremely Greek place. And so for that reason, if you were a Jew and you were traveling from the area, say, of Galilee down to Jerusalem for one of the festivals, you had two bad choices. You could go through Gentile Decapolis, or you could go through Samaria. And they didn't really like either one of those. And so a lot of them, like Jesus, traveled both ways. Jesus went through Samaria sometimes and through Decapolis other times. And it's like you would get so disgusted with the Samaritans, you'd decide to go through Decapolis next time. And then you'd get so disgusted with all the idols and gods and stuff, you'd go through Samaria the next time. And that was probably what it was like for many Jews. Well, that Decapolis descends from this Seleucid time, and what the Seleucids wanted to do was convert Israel to be like the Decapolis, which meant doing away with the Jewish God, converting the Jewish temple, which was a pretty neat building, into, say, a temple to Zeus, and otherwise stamping out this strange to them religion and replacing it with their own Greek religion. And that started under Antiochus III. Well, in verse 17, Antiochus III is going to attempt to initiate a peace with Egypt by offering his daughter to marry Ptolemy V of Egypt. And I think the marriage occurred, but the peace did not. Ultimately, there was just too much at stake, and there was too much water under the bridge. So because of that, in verse 18, Antiochus III takes Asia Minor, but he was stopped by Scipio of Rome. Scipio was a famous Roman commander. And in fact, the Romans were exerting their influence in Asia Minor, and they said, no, you don't, and stopped him. And they even imposed a penalty, a heavy tribute that Seleucus was going to have to pay to Rome to remain independent from Rome. And that tribute's going to come into play. In fact, it's going to be the causa belli for a lot of things that follow. Antiochus returned home to Syria, died, and his empire was going to pass down, but then his empire is going to be usurped in verse 20 by Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV is not a direct descendant of Antiochus III. There were actually several folks who had a claim to the throne, and Antiochus IV is going to manage to kill or poison or otherwise dispose of those and move himself into a position to take the throne. And he does so with the help of Rome's primary client in the area. And so the Romans recognize Antiochus IV as the rightful ruler as long as he pays the annual tribute that they now demand from the Seleucids. And that's where we're at in chapter 20. Antiochus IV is now the ruler of the Seleucids, and he's got several issues going. Number one, he wants to conquer Egypt, like all the Seleucids before him. Number two, he has got to generate some big-time income in order to pay this tribute to Rome. And so he's got two good reasons to want to conquer Egypt. You can either heavily tax your own people, or you can go conquer some other land and take their wealth and pay the tribute that way. And so everything is set up by the time we get to verse 20 for this epic battle between Seleucid and the Ptolemies. And we begin, if somebody can read verse 20 through 28 for us.
Then in this place one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel Yet within a few days he will be shattered, though neither in anger nor in battle. And in his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. And the overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, and also the prince of the covenant. And after an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception, and he will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm, and he will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. And he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. And those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the holy covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land.
All right, so part of this deals with the illicit way in which Antiochus IV achieves power by deceit, by poisoning, not by force of arms. He's only got a small band of folks with him, but he's able to achieve power. And then he goes, his method of dealing with the world around him was very duplicitous. He would make treaties, he would break treaties, he would lie, sometimes he would get involved in military campaigns. And he was pressed between two forces. To his east, he was constantly worried about his eastern border, as well as trying to take on the king of the south, the Ptolemies, the Egyptians. And so he was kind of constantly pressed between these two, and then you've got Rome breathing down your neck, wanting their annual tribute. Well, he was fairly successful initially because he was so duplicitous. He fooled some people. Of course, it says at one point they're lying to each other. Both the king of the north and the king of the south are using similar means. And initially, he's a little bit successful. He's able to create a fairly large army. In fact, one of the largest armies of that era. And he's able to gain a lot of money that he can be paying off the Romans with. And things are looking good for him. He's gradually solidifying both his eastern and western borders and getting ready for this big push into Egypt. All right, and we're going to get the big push into Egypt in this next portion. Let's read verse 29 through 35. Anybody?
At the appointed time, he will return and come into the south. But this last time, it will not turn out the way it did before. For ships of Kittim will come against him. Therefore, he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant and take action. So he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly toward the covenant. But the people who know their God will display strength and take action. Those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many. Yet they will fall by sword
All right, so Antiochus puts together this very large army reminiscent of the large army put together by Antiochus III. And again, he's gathering troops from all over his empire, different peoples, and he attempts at the last minute, as they're coming through Israel, to raise a force of Jews to fight in his army. And the Jews, seeing the way things have turned out several times, are extremely resistant. They don't want to fight in Antiochus IV's army. And so unlike the time of Antiochus III, where you had sufficient number of Jews willing to go follow, even though there was some resistance, this time the resistance is pretty solid, and there's nothing he can do about it because he's on the march going to Egypt. But he remembers. He's going to punish them when he gets the chance. So he comes through, he enters Egypt, and a lone Roman ambassador, I say alone, he probably had a small little group with him, by the name of Gaius Populus Linnaeus, rides out and meets this giant army. Now you can see the army of Antiochus IV. There's chariots, there's war elephants, there's tens of thousands of spearmen, and there's bowmen, and there's cavalry, and he's got this massive army entrained behind him, and this little Roman ambassador rides out to him and says, "Turn your army around and go back. We don't want you to." Rome is now officially protecting Egypt. Well, I got this whole big army behind me that I spent a lot of effort raising, and the idea is I want to conquer Egypt. And so Antiochus says, "Well, wait a minute. I need to take counsel and figure out what to do." And Gaius Populus takes a spear, and he sticks the point of the spear in the sand, and he draws a circle all the way around Antiochus IV. This had to be embarrassing. And he says, "Take as long as you want, just don't step outside this circle before you give me an answer." And hands the spear back to a soldier. Well, Antiochus IV had been a hostage in Rome earlier. That's one of the reasons he was able to come to power. And so he knew the power of the Romans. He knew he had been in Rome. He had been throughout the Roman Empire, and he understood just how strong they were. And rather than stand there like a fool in front of his whole army in this circle made by a single Roman, he says, "Okay," and they turn around to go back. Well, having failed in attacking Egypt, he remembers the Jews did not help me. And so on his way back with this massive army, he decides it's time once for all to stamp out this Jewish religion and to stamp out this Jewish independence and to fully bring them under my empire. And so begins a terrible oppression, including the first abomination of desolation. There's an abomination of desolation that's yet to come. It's going to be part of the tribulation. But the first one, the prototype for it, is done under Antiochus IV. And he brings idols into the temple in Jerusalem. He sacrifices a pig on the altar, on the Jewish altar in the temple, and bans the worship of Yahweh. And starts putting priests and Levites to death, and is going to, by force of arms, convert the people over to Zeus worship or whatever set of gods he wants them to worship. This spawns what we call the Maccabee Revolt. In the Catholic Bible, you've got 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees that are the Jewish history books that go through the record of the Maccabean revolt. And their history is, for the most part, pretty accurate. They don't belong in the Bible, but they're really good history books. And so if you got a friend with a Catholic Bible and you want to read those, you can get them, or you can learn about the Maccabees. But that's the Jewish revolt that ultimately is going to prevail They're not going to directly defeat Antiochus in battle, but they're going to defeat his forces and ultimately set up, at least briefly until the Romans come through, an independent Jewish state that's going to last for a little while. Antiochus himself is going to die a death probably on the other end of the empire, on the eastern side of the empire, and he's ultimately going, but he becomes sort of the archetypical Antichrist. Antiochus is a good pattern for the Antichrist, and that's why in our passage it's going to bleed right over to the Antichrist, because from verse 36 on, we're no longer talking about Antiochus IV, even though it would appear that way to the casual reader. We're now talking about the Antichrist. In this vision, and remember, this is a vision that Daniel's seen, it's going to skip over thousands of years of history between verse 35 and verse 36. So if somebody will read verse 36, let's go all the way to the end of the chapter.
Then the king will do as he pleases, and he will exalt and magnify himself above every god, and will speak monstrous things about the God of gods. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished. For that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the desire of women, nor will he show regard for any other god, for he will magnify himself above them all. But instead he will honor a god of fortress, a god whom his fathers did not know. He will honor him with gold, silver, costly stones, and treasures. He will take action against the strongest of the fortresses with the help of a foreign god. He will give great honor to those who acknowledge him, and will cause them to rule over the many. And he will parcel out land for a price. At the end of time, the king of the south will collide with him, and the king of the north will storm against him with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships, and he will enter countries, overflow them, and pass through. He will also enter the beautiful land, and many countries will fall. But these will be rescued out of his hand: Edom, Moab, and the foremost of the sons of Ammon. Then he will stretch out his hand against other countries, and the land of Egypt will not escape. He will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians will follow at his heels. But rumors from the east and from the north will disturb him, and he will go forth with great wrath to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch the tents of his royal pavilion between the seas and the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him.
There's a variety of clues in here that we're not talking about Antiochus. First of all, Antiochus promoted the Greek gods. He forced worship of the Greek gods, the gods of his fathers. This ruler of the north has abandoned all gods except for the new, strange, foreign god that nobody knows, which ultimately is Satan. He is causing people to worship himself and to worship Satan, but no other god is allowed. So that's very different than Antiochus. Antiochus died in the eastern part of his empire. The Antichrist is going to be taken at Armageddon. He's going to be taken in the Holy Land. There are similarities. Antiochus is a prototype, but there are also very severe differences between Antiochus and the Antichrist. Well, here's part of what we want to get out of this. Number one, I made the point earlier, God already knows everything that's going to happen in history. And if you find yourself living in a prophecy, guess what? God has told you how it's going to be, and there's no amount of effort that you can exert that's going to change the way God has prophesied something is going to be. There's a lot. That doesn't mean you don't exert effort. Obviously, we have many other reasons, and we can talk about why. I don't want us to fall into a fatalism, but I want you to realize if God said it, that settles it. It's done. It's going to happen. just as we see by comparing the history of the kings of the south and north with these prophecies. And so the second part of that is what is still unfulfilled, verse 36 and following, is going to happen just as certainly, just as accurately to detail as what happened before. And so this gives us an insight into what it's going to be like in the tribulation and how the one we call the Antichrist, the one that's called here King of the North, is going to operate. And he's going to appear very, very successful. But in the end, he's going to hear rumors. Jesus is coming back. And he's going to decide to turn his forces away from the kings of the south and the kings of the east and others that he's been engaging with. And he's going to prepare to fight against Jesus. And he's not going to win. And you can read about that one in Revelation 19 if you're not sure how that turns out. So that's going to be his end. In fact, he's going to be the very first one to go in the lake of fire. The Antichrist and his henchman, the false prophet, are going to be thrown into the lake of fire 1,000 years before anybody else. They go at the beginning of the reign of Christ. And no one else enters the lake of fire until the end of the reign of Christ, that end of the 1,000 years that Jesus is going to reign. Well, that is Daniel chapter 11. It's a fascinating chapter. I think it's the longest chapter in the book, certainly the longest chapter in the prophetic section, the last 6. And the detail is so remarkable that this chapter's come under almost relentless attack from the liberals, saying, well, nobody could give that kind of accurate prophecy ahead of time. Again, God is outside of time, space, and matter. He can give accurate prophecy very easily. Next week, Daniel chapter 12, just a kind of fun conclusion to the book. And then the day after next Sunday, I head to Vietnam, so I'll be gone all the month of May. And when I get back, Lord willing, we're going to do the book of Ruth, and then we'll follow that up with something else. I've got I think I know what I'm going to do, but I'm still, if you've got a request, a suggestion, I'm still open to hearing those. Let's pray and we'll dismiss. Father, we do thank you once again for the clarity of your word. We stand amazed at the detail of this chapter, Father, at how you laid out historically, king by king and event by event, exactly what would happen and how these things, at least up through verse 35, took place precisely as you said they would. And so we're confident, Father, in the prophecies that have yet to be fulfilled, that you are the God who knows all of time, all of space, everything in human history, that it has happened and it is going to happen. We're confident that with you and your word as our guide, we could face whatever comes. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.